Well then, friends and viewers and cryptids who have figured out how to use the smartphones of their prey, it's time once again for some allegedly true and scary winter stories. Fire up an absolutely indignant cup of hot cocoa and get cozy under a thick blanket, then release all that static you just built up into your favorite family member. Because it's going to be a dark, cold night. If you have a scary story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear some Yellowstone National Park stories, stories from McDonald's employees, and creepy tales from Canada. Also, follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on iTunes and Spotify if you prefer to listen audio only. Leave us a review on iTunes too. It's a free way to wish us a happy holidays. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Dude in the Woods, from Sinamongus. I am a truck driver. I work for a certain water company that is located in Michigan. The route that I drive for this company takes me as far as the Upper Peninsula, down to central Michigan. To give an idea of where this creepy experience took place, I was near Roscommon County. This was way back in late January, when the night would come as quickly as 5 p.m. I was driving down a rural highway around 8 p.m., and a snowstorm was picking up. Now, the trucks provided by my company, I can't say they're in the best condition, but we have to drive them anyway. As I was cruising down the highway, my truck began to sputter and shake. With a sigh, I pulled off to the side of the road, turned on my hazard lights, and put the vehicle in park. I've been dealing with this all day because of a coolant leak in the heater core. I have to fill up the coolant reservoir, which takes about 5 minutes. Dressed in nothing more but my regular clothes and a baseball cap, I exit my truck and I enter the snowy January night. I unlatched my hood and pulled it up. The sound of it opening was the only sound to be heard. It was very quiet out there at the time except for some blowing wind. The night was overcast and very dark due to the storm. My only light was from the hazards on the truck and a small flashlight in my mouth. The thick line of woods is about 100 feet away from each side of the road, and I was parked along the shoulder on the side of the highway. As I began to fill up the coolant reservoir, I heard some rustling in the undergrowth about 150 to 200 feet deeper in the woods. I thought nothing of it due to the fact that deer are common even during winter. But the strangest thing was the rustling was quite loud, like a lot louder than animals would usually be. I mean, the wind was blowing decently hard, but I could still hear the rustling in the woods. I was wondering what could be so loud when I heard a loud crack and a soft thud. Now this noise really got my attention. It didn't sound like a deer anymore, it sounded more like a person stumbling around. Humans are very loud in the woods, and no animal would purposely make a noise to give itself away like that, especially that loud. Yes, there were bears, but it wasn't a big concern for me in that area. Now, a real concern I had was that the last house I saw was about 10 miles away, and no cars had passed me by yet, and somehow there was some dude walking around out there in the woods in the middle of a snowstorm. Still cautious of the guy walking around, I finished refilling the reservoir. I locked the hood down and began to enter the truck. Before exiting the truck, I had the windows down. I kept them down due to the fact I could still hear the guy out there. Then, as soon as the crashing around the forest started, it just as quickly stopped. That put me on edge. I felt the air around me grow thick and heavy, even though the winter air was dry. I turned the key in the ignition. A loud beep resounded from the truck dash, therefore allowing me to turn it on. The truck roared to life, and I started to pull back onto the road to continue driving. As soon as my truck started rolling, I heard the crashing start up again, but at a loud and quickened pace. By the sound of it, Whatever it was seemed to be making a line straight for the truck. I thought this guy was dumb or something, but it still freaked me out, so I pushed the truck to go faster. With the hazard light still on, I could see the outer edges of the semi. And then I saw them. There was a person running near the rear passenger side of the trailer. The creepy part about it was that I was traveling at about 15 miles per hour and pushing it, still climbing, and the guy was fast enough to keep up, and he was closing the distance to my cab. Now, with the cold sweat, I pushed the truck into a higher gear, and the engine roared louder. I was pushing 25 miles per hour, and this guy was almost to the cab, when all of a sudden he just disappeared. It seemed he was so focused on catching up with the truck that he failed to notice and hit the guardrail on the side of the road. Though it still freaked me out, I continued traveling down the road, ignoring the speed limits until I got to the hotel I would be staying at. That was just one of the creepiest moments on the road. Watching Me in the Dark, from Gus. I'd like to start by saying I'm not religious, but I've experienced things that I can't explain and can only attribute to the supernatural. This story takes place when I was in my junior year of high school. I'm 21 now. It was almost Christmas, and my parents asked me if I'd like to visit my family in Mexico this year and spend Christmas there. Of course, I said yes, so off I went for 2 weeks. I went with my cousin's family by car and got there in about 3 days. We made it, and my family and I hugged. They cried for finally seeing me after such a long time. It was great. Around 4 days later, one night, we were all outside telling scary stories. I'll be honest, it did creep me out, but I tried not to show it. When it came time to go to sleep, I was kinda nervous because it's super dark at night, and especially because this is a village near the mountains. And yeah, it's pretty poor there. They have streetlights, but they're not that bright. My grandmother was sleeping next to me in a different bed, and my cousins and their parents were in the next room with no door. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up. I felt cold. When I looked down at my feet, my covers were at my knees, so I got up to get them. But then I looked up a little, and at the end of the bed was a shadow. It was darker than the room, and easily 7 feet tall. Now, I'm not trying to act cool, but I wasn't scared at the moment. I didn't move, though. I was just staring it down, trying to figure out what it was. When I moved a little, it began to sink into the ground. It was so fast, I didn't know what to do. But somehow, soon I went back to sleep. The following day, I kept quiet and didn't tell anyone. Thinking back on this experience, what scares me isn't the shadow being itself, but the thought of how long it may have been there and what it was doing before I woke up. Most importantly, why? Why me? It's all so weird. The Creature at My Company, from ZappyBack. I am a 17-year-old guy who lives in a rather small city in the Netherlands. Our school system works a little different than most countries, as we go to primary school for about 8 years until we're 12, and then head on to secondary education from age 12 to 16. I was an early student, so at the time I had just turned 17. As I had just finished my exams, I had winter vacation about 4 weeks earlier than the rest of the country. Now, at the time, I had no job, and seeing that almost all my friends had 4 more weeks of school to attend, I thought it would be smart to get a job. I started work at this small company where we shipped out artificial grass to customers. The company was basically 2 large warehouses next to each other, connected with a very big door at the end of the hall. The room I worked in was connected on the right side of the big hall. It was a rather small room, But seeing as we only created small artificial grass samples and did some small tasks on the side, we didn't need that much room. The 2 warehouses were used to store the actual big grass rolls people ordered to lay in their yard, for example. There was also a small canteen where we could eat and drink during our breaks. The canteen was also connected to the main hall, and you almost always went through the canteen to get into the main hall. Lastly, there is some sort of attic in the back of the main hall. This attic is used to store failed grass rolls or grass rolls that never had a chance to be delivered. Basically, all the junk was thrown in the attic. This attic had no walls, so when you would stand in the main hall, you could see right into the attic. I didn't work on the shipping crew. No, my job was to create small artificial grass samples by gluing a small piece of grass to a piece of information paper. Then we'd ship out small boxes with 1 to 4 pieces of artificial grass so our customers could choose what grass they wanted to buy. We delivered to the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium. On a normal day, we'd have around 300 boxes shipped out in total. And seeing how most people wanted at least 2 grass samples, and some even 4, I had to make around 800 artificial grass samples a day, together with a colleague. Thursdays were different though. Thursdays were very busy, and sometimes we'd have twice the work compared to a normal day. Sometimes we would start way earlier than usual on Thursdays, since we had so much work to do. Normally we'd start at 7, but if you wanted to start earlier you could. Sometimes we'd start at 5 a.m. on Thursdays. So it was a Wednesday and I asked my coworker if he also started at 5 the next day, because it would be a Thursday. He said he'd like to, but he couldn't. He had a day off to spend with his family. He said if I wanted to start early I could, but I would be the only one until 6 a.m. That would be when the shipping crew started. He said that I had to discuss this with the boss and see if I could get the keys. After talking with my boss, he said I had a great attitude and happily handed me a set of spare keys so I could let myself in the next morning. I couldn't be happier, since I made my boss happy, and I got to work more hours, and I would have some alone time the next morning to listen to music or something. The following morning, I arrived at work around 4:55 a.m., and I let myself in to start work. I went to the canteen to make myself a coffee. After all, it was still 5 a.m. in the morning. I scrolled a bit on my phone and forgot the time. I then saw it was 5:07 a.m. I grabbed my coffee and went to my workspace. Now, on the outside of the walls of the room I worked in were almost all the light switches. The light switch of my room was there. The one of the main hall and the second hall were there too, as well as the light switch of the office located above the canteen. The only one that wasn't there was the canteen itself. So I flicked on the light switch of my workspace in the main hall. But when I did, no lights came on. I was still listening to music, so I went ahead and flicked it back off. The hall was so dark, I couldn't even see the huge scaffolding where the grass rolls were stored, located all along the left wall of the main hall. At one point, I tried the switches again, but nothing happened. By chance, I knew how to reset the power if it was ever cut. I overheard my coworker saying how to do it for another colleague of mine. The fuse box was located all the way in the back of the main hall. But the hall was so dark, I almost couldn't see my own hand in front of me. The weird thing was the light in the canteen worked perfectly fine, so there was some light illuminating the beginning of the main hall. The power to the canteen must have been connected to a different set of earthing switches, I thought to myself. I needed the power not just for the light, but if there was no power, there was no way to heat up the glue guns to glue the grass samples to the information paper. I also couldn't open up the huge rolling door because it was still dark outside and it would help very little. I walked back into the canteen to think over my options. I remembered I of course still had a mobile phone with a flashlight I could use to find my way to the fuse box at the end of the hall. It was my only choice, so I made my way back into the main hall, turning on the flashlight on my phone. When the light came on, I came to a big discovery. One of the scaffolding had been knocked over. This was next to impossible, as these things were at least 10 meters high, and there was no way a human being could do it. The only way one of these scaffolding could be knocked over had to be with a forklift. We had 2 forklifts we used to pick up the grass rolls and put them into a truck to deliver the grass to customers. But if this happened yesterday, the crew would clean the mess up instantly. So when did it happen? I considered calling my boss, but I wanted to turn on the light first. After glancing one last time at the mess of the fallen scaffolding, I turned and made my way to the back of the main hall. But when I pointed my light to the end of the hall, it illuminated a big part of the attic as well. I got the biggest shock of my life as I looked to this astounding and disgusting creature standing in the attic on the edge of the floor. I could see the creature almost perfectly, even though there was still no light. This creature looked distorted. It looked so wrong. It sort of looked like a man with legs bending backwards and hooves as feet. Its fingers were at least 30 centimeters long, and it had the brightest yellow eyes I'd ever seen. Its skin was rotting, and in some places I could even see bone due to the skin that was coming off of its body. Then the creature began to speak to me. I couldn't believe I was hearing anything coming from an animal that looked like that. The creature spoke in a low, angry, and distorted voice. I stood there in full disgust. The creature screamed at me. It was such a deafening scream I could hear my ears ringing inside of my skull. It was then that I made a break for the canteen. When I turned away, I could hear a loud thump on the ground. I didn't look back, but I suppose it was when the creature jumped down from the attic onto the ground. I ran through the canteen into the hallway, then out the door. It was still so dark outside, and I had no idea where to go. I heard this creature crashing into the huge rolling gate. I got my senses together, and I hid in a descending path for unloading trucks at the company next door. This took me about 10 seconds. When I got into the place, I could hear another loud crash into the door. After that, there was dead silence. Then the huge rolling door began to open. It went slower than normal, but maybe that creature had broken something, causing the door to rise more slowly. I could see the pure black hooves slowly being revealed as the door proceeded to open. It amazed me at how the creature got the door open. The only way to open the door was by pressing on a small button with an up arrow on it. When the door was far enough open, it stepped out onto the street and into the moonlight. I could see it looking around and sniffing. This thing was at least 3 meters tall. It felt like an eternity passed before the creature stopped sniffing. Then it ran off, and it never came back. I got back inside as fast as I could, which wasn't the smartest thing to do. I closed the rolling gate, and to my surprise, the power was back on. All the lights were turned on, and I could see everything perfectly fine now. I never told anyone about this story, and I told my boss I had no idea how that scaffolding got knocked over. 1 week later, I quit my job there, and in that last week I never started my shift early. The Mysterious Man, from Albert S. I was about 24 when this took place. I used to haul anything with my old 79 Peterbilt, which leads up to this story. It was getting dark quickly since it was December, and I was trying to get to my destination before a snowstorm hit, so I was going a little over the speed limit. I had only seen a single other rig on this lonely road. It was probably 8 p.m. when something I'll never forget happened. I had gotten a decent look at a cop earlier who had pulled me over, so I recognized his face. After a while of lonely driving, I saw something on the road. I began to jakebrake to slow myself. I'd got up close when I realized it was the cop again, but his car was nowhere to be seen. I reached down to get my old camera to take a picture, but when I looked up, he was gone. By then, I was a little freaked out. I then realized ice was on the road, so my truck couldn't get moving again, which meant I'd have to get out. So I grabbed my 12 gauge and got out to put chains on the tires to move, which takes a minute if you're new to trucking. I deliberately put the chain on in a way it would come off, since at that point I didn't want to get out of my truck anymore, so I let the chain fly off by itself. When it did fly off, I heard it hit the trailer, but then I heard this mysterious screeching sound. When I looked out my mirror, I saw something hanging off the deck in between the trailer and the cab. At that point, I was so freaked out, I hit the gas even harder. As my truck sped up to nearly 100 miles per hour, I had hit a patch of ice causing my trailer to dogtail around a corner, which did save me from rolling. But then I spotted a car. Realizing my trailer was still dogtailing, I swung my steering wheel to the right, causing my truck to roll over and go down into a gully. That's where I saw him again. Wide-eyed and smiling, he walked to the hood of my truck, which surprisingly stayed on. I used what strength I had to grab my shotgun and fired 7 rounds into the man. He let out a scream and fell to the ground. After I climbed out of my rig, I left on foot, but I never saw the body of the man. There was absolutely no trace of him. But if you want to avoid running into him yourself, keep an eye out on the roads between New York and Montana. Drumming in the Snow, from Silver Bullet 54. In the winter of 2014, I took a trip to a cabin with 3 of my friends, Chuck, Andy, and Terry. We had decided to go to Terry's own cabin high in the Appalachian Mountains somewhere in Tennessee. I believe that's where it was. She said it was a great place to see animals in their natural habitat. Well, after arriving there, one morning I woke up to a thumping sound. At first I thought it was snow, but when I looked out the window there was no snow falling at all. The thumping got louder, so I told the 3 of them to stop fooling around. Terry came into my room as pale as printer paper. "You hear that?" she asked. I nodded, and said it was probably Chuck or Andy playing a prank. However, Chuck and Andy were still sleeping. Terry and I looked at each other, then we quickly woke up the other 2 and told them to barricade the door. Andy obeyed, but Chuck didn't seem very concerned. He took out his golf bag that he had. He was on the high school golfing team, and said he wouldn't be scared with his equalizer in hand. He slowly pulled out a rifle used for hunting. He took aim at the window close to him, ready to shoot at the slightest movement. The thumping was so close, all 4 of us realized it was a drum. The sound went around the cabin twice, then faded away. Terry, Andy, and Chuck were silent. Finally, I said, "That's it, I'm done." But Chuck told me they had paid a week-long price, and we still had 2 days left at that point. Well, day 6 passed without incident, thankfully. On the final day, we had just finished lunch when we heard a familiar sound. Thump, thump, thumping. The drumming had returned. All 4 of us ran outside, each of us carrying a weapon of some sort. I had a plank of wood, Chuck his rifle, Terry a chain used for snow tires, and Andy one of the golf clubs that Chuck kept in his bag. We all listened as the drumming went around and around in a thicket, so we couldn't see who or what it was. After what seemed like hours, the drumming faded away. All 4 of us split up, but found nothing. No footprints, no boot prints, no broken branches, nothing at all. We all decided that enough was enough. We packed up and left. Once we had calmed down, Chuck spoke up. You know, we're in an area that saw action during the Civil War. Do you think, We all knew what he didn't say. I decided that we must have been hearing a reenactment of someone doing their duty. They had drummers in the 1860s. Those drummers could be as young as 12 in some cases. I don't know who we were hearing. I didn't bring it up at the time, but we had all left gear, like our winter hats and gloves, back at the cabin. As far as I know or care, maybe they're still there. As for the drummer, he's probably still there in the mountains, drumming into a battle that ended over a century and a half ago. The Thing Haunting Me and My Grandmother, from Jasper 02. I'm 18 and I live with my 2 grandmothers. My dad works out of town. We have strange things happen almost every day. It's been going on for 5 years. Me and one of my grandmothers are trying to figure out what's going on. Now, of my 2 grandmothers, one of them has some history with hanging out with bad people. Her name is Ginny, and I'll share some stories that she told me. So Grandma Ginny was friends with her assistant counselor, whose name is Molly, and they would share personal things and secrets with each other. Molly would later tell my grandmother she was a witch. One night in the year of 2014, my Grandma Ginny and Molly were talking and having some drinks. Then my grandma compared Molly to Molly's mother, but she didn't mean it in a bad way. Molly got mad and tried to attack my grandma. She threatened to go upstairs and attack my other grandmother, Joanne, who was my Grandma Ginny's mother. Ginny then kicked Molly out of the house during a snowstorm, and they never talked again. A year later is when the paranormal stuff happened. Grandma Ginny told me that she found out the reason Molly was a witch. Molly's mother was a witch and was raised in a coven of other witches. Now, when I started visiting my Grandma Ginny's house in 2015, I didn't notice anything paranormal for another year, not until she told me the story of Molly and the things she had been experiencing. I should mention that Ginny has 2 cameras on the first floor of the house we live in. She watches them down in the second floor in her room for any signs of movement. She has security alarms almost all over the house that she will turn on when everyone goes to bed. Then she'll turn them off in the daytime. She often hears footsteps and sometimes voices coming from the first floor through the camera, but it won't trigger the alarm. When I started to hear noises, it was only footsteps at first, but it eventually got worse. Beds were starting to get messed up after they were made. People would feel as if they were being watched. I have a few terrifying moments of my own. I was walking out of the bathroom one day when I heard a woman's voice saying something. I couldn't tell what it was saying, but I didn't care. I ran back into the bathroom and slammed the door behind me. I didn't come out until I couldn't hear anything. On another occasion, I was trying to fall asleep under my covers when I heard what sounded like a man growling over me. I was too scared to look for a moment, so I waited a few seconds and looked to see, but no one was there, and there was nothing next to my bed. After years of these paranormal events, I decided to investigate and to find some answers. I remembered the story my Grandma Ginny had told me about. The story about Molly, who used to be her friend, the witch. I believe Molly may have brought a bad spirit here, because she hated my Grandma Ginny for kicking her out of the house in the middle of a snowstorm. We also heard weird noises on the camera, like growling and moaning sounds in the attic. My grandma and I have gotten random bruises as well. There's a lot that I want to share, but these are the most important ones I wanted to mention. This is probably the only time I'll share something like this, but I might give an update in the future. But thank you for taking the time to listen to my story.